Hi guys, my name is Laura. Welcome back to my channel. Today I want to talk about composition, which is a very basic and often overlooked topic in photography. The thing is, getting better at composition is the easiest and fastest way to level up your photography instantly. I don't care if you have the fanciest and most expensive equipment in the world. If your compositions aren't on point, then your photos are just going to be lacking. By the way, if you guys are new to my channel, I talk about all things photography, so if you're interested in more beginner photography tutorials, tips, and techniques, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and like this video. Okay, so let's start with the basics. What exactly is composition? Composition is what you show the viewer and how you frame it. It can really mean a lot of different things. So some examples of different elements of composition can be framing, symmetry, negative space, movement, patterns, and the cropping of your image. All of those things are going to affect your end result of your composition. The important thing that I want you to note for now is that multiple different elements make up your composition, and it's best when you layer them on top of each other. So these are not mutually exclusive concepts where if an image has symmetry, it cannot have negative space, or if an image has a certain type of framing, it cannot have movement. You want to use all of these concepts together and layer them on top of each other to create really beautiful images. Another important thing to remember about composition, and I'll quote the great Ansel Adams in order to make this point, is that you don't take a photo, you make it. So when you're out shooting, you do kind of want to actively think about all these different elements of composition to improve your photo, and eventually they'll really just come like second nature to you. In fact, a lot of people that you hear, people say they have an eye for photography, this is sort of what it means, that you just have this innate ability to just see a composition and just know when it's right. Let's start out by talking about a couple basic principles and rules of photography that will instantly help you make your compositions better. So the first one, and this is one of my favorites, is leading lines. And leading lines can be man-made structures within your photo, like roads or railings, or they can be natural elements, like you see here. The point, though, is that the leading line is going to lead the viewer's eye to the subject of the photo. So you're using these lines to draw attention to your subject and help focus your viewer in on a certain part of the photo. Leading lines also, coincidentally, create depth in your image, and they also create a lot of symmetry. So remember, those are other elements of composition that we're going to be layering on top of each other when we're using leading lines in our photo. Next up, let's touch on the rule of thirds, which is probably the most popular and well-known rule of photography. And the rule of thirds states that you basically want to split your photo into 9 equal quadrants. So draw 2 vertical lines and 2 horizontal lines on your image. And ideally, you want to place your subject at the crosshairs of one of those intersections of those lines. Now, one easy way to remember to start thinking more about rule of thirds is to turn your grid finder on. There's really no mathematical or scientific reasoning behind this that I know of. Just remember that it sometimes can be very pleasing to the eye to have your subject slightly offset to one side instead of always having them in the center of your photo. Now, while we're on the topic of the rule of thirds, I'll tell you that the number 3 seems to be an important number in photography. There's also the rule of triangles and the rule of odds, which states that it's better to have an odd number of subjects in your photos than an even number. Next up, we have the rule of space, and this is a rule that I go back to all the time because I do shoot a lot of landscapes. The rule of space states that your subject should be facing any negative space in your shot, which makes sense. Obviously, if you have someone out, looking out over a really beautiful cliff or something like that, you want them facing the area of the landscape that the viewer can see. If they're at the edge of the photo and they're facing the opposite way, basically facing off screen, it doesn't really tell a story, and it kind of leads the viewer feeling weird, like what are they looking at? So you really want to use this rule to tell the story of your photo with your subject. Next up, we have minimalism, and you can achieve minimalism in a number of different ways in your shot. You can try cropping in closer. You can try just having cleaner, more simple backgrounds. But at the end of the day, what a minimal photo is going to do is allow the viewer to have a singular point of focus, and that can be very pleasing to the eye. It's often times that I take super simple photos, and they always end up being my favorites just because they're just clean and simple and nice to look at. Next up, we have the use of colors and patterns. And if you've ever seen any of my photos before, you know that I'm not afraid of a little bit of saturation. Now, when choosing what colors to include in your shot, it's suggested to either use complementary colors, so those that are next to each other on the color wheel, or opposite colors, so colors that are on the opposite side of the color wheel from one another. Patterns can also lead to some interesting details and just capture the attention of the viewer. They draw the viewer into the photo and make them sort of do a double take. So you can do that via shadows, tiles, geometric patterns, or using shadow cutouts to emphasize a portrait. Next up, we have framing, which is arguably the most important part of composition. You can choose to frame your shot in so many different ways, but here are a couple examples. You could frame a landscape shot with a natural element like these flowers. Another option is to add some props to the foreground of your photo in order to give somewhat of contextual framing or to sort of paint a story for your subject. Another really fun technique when it comes to framing is doing shoot-throughs. So whether that's shooting through a chain link fence or shooting through a door frame, you can use man-made elements in order to frame your image. Lastly, we have symmetry, and as you probably know, symmetry is very pleasing to the human eye. I'm sure you guys have heard the fact that people with symmetrical faces are perceived as more beautiful than others because the human eye just tends to like and seek out symmetry. One of the most important and basic ways to incorporate symmetry in your image is to make sure that any lines, like horizon lines, are straight. If you have crooked horizon lines in your image, it's going to be extremely distracting to the viewer. Another creative way that you can incorporate symmetry into your image is to do reflection shots, for example, where you have a person or object reflected in a pool of water. I know we talked about all these different quote-unquote rules of photography. I think it's also important to remember that you need to break the rules in photography as well. Obviously, photography is a science, but it's also an art and it's creative, and you have to be willing to think outside the box. There are so many images out there in the world that break a ton of the rules we just mentioned, but they're still amazing images. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I can't wait to see what you guys come up with. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe, and I'll see you guys on the next one. Next up, we have, can people like leave me alone? I swear to God. Next up, we have composition, which is arguably one of the most important parts of composition, and their silhouette reflected in that pool. An easy way to think more about the rule of thirds is to turn your viewfinder on. Your composition is kind of a all-encompassing topic, and all-encompassing. And I'll quote the great Ansel.